This episode is sponsored by Silent Sticks. Quietly delicious.
For the rest of your long, miserable life, you will carry the scar of failure. Now go get me a beer.
How do bad behaviors start? Are they just the product of society, or are they something more personal to us as individuals? Do poor traits come from our environment or from within? These are questions that go far beyond my capability to answer, which is why I'm just here reviewing a silly little episode of King of the Hill. And in this third episode of King of the Hill, titled Order of the Straight Arrow, we are granted a view of Hank Hill that has been hidden up until this point. The first two episodes placed Hank in a very stick-in-the-mud sort of role, where he isn't allowed to have much fun and is usually the voice of reason. But here, the entire episode is centered around the guys trying to pull pranks on the kids, giving us an idea of their sense of humor. But as we'll come to see, while good-natured pranks have their place, there are certain mindsets that can lead to some levels of personal strife. And before I start up the episode discussion properly, I want to put forward my own definition of a prank, because if you look up pranks on YouTube, then you'll quickly find some of the most toxic, obnoxious, and awful behavior imaginable. And for me, for my definition, a prank is something that relies on deception and, importantly, once the joke has been revealed, there should be a reasonable expectation that the person being pranked will be able to laugh at themselves and be in on the joke. Pranks should not be pretending to rob someone or making it look like you glued yourself to a railroad track or whatever. There's a difference between surprising someone with a bit of unexpected tomfoolery and actively hitting them with a fight or flight survival moment. And to be fair, a lot of the putrid shit you see on YouTube today did spawn from hidden camera shows, the granddaddy of them all being Candid Camera, which started life as Candid Microphone back in 1947, but the most unpleasant side of the prank formula arguably came from Jackass, which wouldn't begin airing until the year 2000, a few years beyond this episode of King of the Hill. And thankfully, we don't have to see that sort of hyper-extreme sort of pranks taking place here. The Order of the Straight Arrow takes a more traditional view of pranks, where the joke is that kids are gullible and stupid and will genuinely believe anything an adult tells them. And while many kids these days are more skeptical than previous generations, being aware that, these sort of things can happen, anyone who has interacted with young children will be aware that kids often don't have the critical thinking skills necessary to think for themselves, especially in regards to a parent or trusted adult. I myself was told by my Uncle Scott that the word gullible wasn't in the dictionary, which caused me to go and find the word and show it to him. Although old Scott kind of fucked up that joke because it wasn't that I believed him and therefore was looking up to check, but that I thought he was being stupid and the only way to prove him wrong was to present him evidence. And that's not me being gullible, Scott. That's me citing a source, you silly Billy, you sneaky Pete. In any case, this episode embodies that same sort of spirit of, haha, let's get the boys with a real stinger of a joke. And it all begins with a flashback to the guy's childhood, making this the third episode in a row where Hank's dad is seen in flashback but has not yet been given a name. And besides Hank's dad, the rest of the fathers are an extremely simplified version of our core characters, really just clones of their older sons. And the guys themselves are more like small adult versions of themselves, rather than actual kids. It's honestly just sort of an okay opener with a few little tee-hees here and there, but what's really important is that it finally gets us to this core aspect of Bill's character, namely that he is very, very depressed.
When I grow up, I'm going to drink this stuff every day, just like my dad, and fly jets and maybe even be an astronaut.
Oh, kids and their crazy dreams.
I'm so depressed I can't even blink.
So the gist of the plot is that Hank and the guys want to replicate the camping trip their dads took them on way back in the day and give their sons a chance to experience the same weekend of spite. Oh, and God, I love this background joke of Bobby accidentally drilling a hole in their canoe and running away. That's great. And here's where we get the first appearance of Eustace, who was part of Hank's original Straight Arrow troupe. And while Eustace feels like he's being set up to be something of a Ned Flanders-esque rival or foil for Hank and the guys, the show barely uses him at all, so I won't waste any more time discussing him or his nothing of a son. And there's also a kid here who looks an awful lot like Boomhauer, and I'm not certain if that's supposed to be like a hint, like, ooh, this is like Boomhauer's secret kid, but his name is Garth, and he kind of looks like Garth from Wayne's World, so I don't know if there's like a reference there, if I'm reaching or whatever. It says that on the King of the Hill fan wiki that might be a connection, but I don't know. I'm not confident enough to, say that for sure. I just want to put that idea out there and say it's not mine, it's something I've heard, and I can kind of see the connection. This episode is also important because it gives us the very first speaking role for John Redcorn. Woo!
Hey, John Redcorn.
Hank, Dell, Bill, Boomhauer.
I should mention that during these first few appearances, John Redcorn is actually voiced by Victor Aaron, who honestly brought such a certain, dignity and awe to the character. It's very charming.
John Redcorn, we've got this Order of the Straight Arrow retreat tomorrow, and I was wondering...
I'd be honored to look after your wife.
Sadly, Victor would end up dying in a car crash in 1996, leaving these episodes to air after his passing. Afterward, John Redcorn would be voiced by Jonathan Joss throughout the rest of the series, and while I do think Jonathan does an excellent job, the show did lose an extremely talented person, and it's a damn shame that poor Victor went out the way he did. R.I.P. Victor. His baritone voice and rhythmic pace of speaking just lends so much to his first appearance, and in a weird way, I almost feel like this version of John Redcorn would be too much of a good guy to let's say it in a Dale-safe and YouTube-safe way, heal Dale's wife the way he does. This version of John Redcorn feels a little too, I don't want to use the word wholesome, but too much of a stand-up guy, you know what I mean? In any case, when the guys ask for, and I'm quoting directly here, I want to be clear about that, when they ask for, quote, funny Indian stuff, unquote, to use on their camping trip, John Redcorn delivers this haunting bit of storytelling.
There is a very ancient ceremony I learned from my grandfather. We call upon the sacred Wematanye, and we ask him to breathe life into our spirit bag.
This bit of reverence is immediately juxtaposed by the guy's casual dumbassery.
The spirit bag is very sacred. You should not make light.
I like how you say everything's sacred. That's funny, too.
God, don't worry, I'll get to this in a second. Put a pin in this. And at the same time the guys are getting ready to go, Luann is preparing to go off to visit her mother, who's appearing in court soon, continuing the side plot of Luann's mother's trip through the legal system. And throughout this whole thing, Peggy seems oddly insistent on getting everyone out of the house.
You and Bobby are my whole life. Come on, kids, let's go! Everybody in the car! On the line, now!
Again, more on this later. So now's the time to clear the air about all of this Wematanye stuff. And this is where the episode might lose a few people, because the guys take the minimal information they've received from John Redcorn and decide to sloppily incorporate it into their trip. So here's the thing, I have two contrasting views on this issue. On the one hand, the guys are definitely, unquestionably, doing some blatant cultural appropriation here. It's about as literal as you can get. We even see the guys wearing face paint and headbands with feathers in them, for God's sakes. It's pretty bad. And so yes, 100%, this is definitely cultural appropriation through and through, but the other part of my brain is telling me that the show isn't making the point of, oh haha, the beliefs of Native people are so silly, look at how weird they are, but instead saying, isn't it amusing that the guys are so ignorant and so out of touch with this side of spirituality and this culture that their half-ass handling of the materials makes us just roll our eyes. Oh my gosh, how silly. Don't believe me? Check this out.
This trip is about the sacredness of Mother Earth and all she gives us. So pee now, 'cause once we're on the road, we ain't stopping.
Now, I'm not trying to defend the show from criticism. The image of Hank Hill in tribal headwear has definitely aged quite badly. But much like Hank's traditional views on sexual education, there's an undertone of mockery directed at Hank that allows this to feel palatable. It's still pretty awkward, all things concerned, but this is a very real and down-to-earth sort of problem, and I don't feel that there's intentional malice behind it. But still, if you think this is pretty yucky and, nothing that you want to really, watch because it's like, oh boy, then that is totally okay. I don't think there's a problem with that. Take this episode, and throw it in the dumpster. I don't care. I'm not super attached to this episode whatsoever, and if this is a deal breaker for you, then I think that's totally fair. But I do want to give the writers credit for at least being somewhat aware of how this may offend people, because smartly, the writers did not use a real word or spirit from any tribes, but instead made up their own word, Wematanye. And Wematanye, if my 5-minute Google search is accurate, was actually taken from the Lenni Lenape word for brotherhood, Wemoktindink. Apologies if I said either of those incorrectly. This fake Wematanye catchphrase allows the guys to use it as a catch-all phrase throughout the trip, which quickly becomes inundated with a bunch of weird trials. The boys are given silent sticks, or as the white man calls them, Slim Jims, to test how good they are at shutting up. And boy, does Hank really put these kids through the ringer to test their commitment to being quiet.
I'm hungry.
No problem.
Mister, you wake up!
Ha! That was a test.
Meanwhile, Dale goes through the experience his wife gets every time John Redcorn comes to visit for a weekend.
Give me a little pressed ham.
God, the showrunners were so proud they got this in past the censors that they reused the exact same footage later, really rubbing it in our faces. Upon arriving to the campsite, the guys discover that there's a large group of hippies that seem to have been recently released from their cryogenic slumber. They really do look like they stepped right out of the 1960s rather than the late 1990s, which, this is supposed to be set in, but I can't speak for the authenticity of whether or not these people even existed at this time. Maybe there were hippies still bumming around Texas campsites in 97, or, more likely, maybe the showrunners didn't know quite how to communicate that these are, these sort of free-spirited, whiny liberals without relying on old 1960s hippie stereotypes, but I don't know. What I do know is that we get this amusing little tease from Hank.
Look at that one, bouncing around in front of God and everybody. Would it kill a tree if she wore a bra?
Yes, Hank, really paint that picture for us. I'm begging you. Anyway, I haven't really been discussing what's been happening with Peggy, and I think this is a good time to discuss her. Get our minds off of all that bouncing around. Throughout the episode, we get these little check-ins with Peggy, where she's driving into the middle of nowhere, withdrawing large amounts of cash and burning the receipts, and using a fake name to stay at a hotel. And what is all this in service of? Well, she's going shopping for shoes. Yes indeed, Peggy, in fact, tell the world, has gigantic feet. They're so big that it's gotten to the point where she has to drive all the way across the state to a specialty store. But hey, they couldn't be that big, right? We're just exaggerating, right?
A size 16 for Senor Ibanez. Triple E. I'll have Chuck and Buzz carry the box out to the car for you.
Okay, that's pretty good. The length she goes to really communicates how much shame she feels about this and cements this character trait in our minds for later episodes. And believe me, when we get there, eventually, the payoff to all of this setup is going to give us huge dividends.
Oh my God.
But don't whip out your silent stick quite yet, that's still a long way off. For now, we've got to get back to the boys, who are going through all the silly ceremonies cooked up by the guys.
A straight arrow loves nature. A straight arrow is against Bill H.R. 57 to allow the importation of South American propane.
Once all of that has been set up, we finally get to the meat of this trip, the snipe hunt. Now, for all of you not in the know, a snipe hunt is where people are tricked into going hunting for an imaginary creature. But confusingly, snipe actually do exist. Apparently there are 26 different kinds of birds that fit into the category of snipe. Don't believe me? Well, idiot, here's a pin-tailed snipe for all of you non-believers. Look at him, look at his little feet, look at his little face, that's him, he's a snipe, haha, there he is. But the snipe of the snipe hunts are supposedly these super deadly animals, more akin to a cryptid. Here's how Dale describes it.
It's got red glowing eyes, long crooked teeth, a claw, and a tail with another claw on the end.
And Bobby, being all hyped up this whole weekend by his dad, goes into gorilla mode and beats the fuck out of an endangered whooping crane. And it's at this point that Hank drops all pretense of mysticism and goes into self-preservation mode, jamming the crane into the cooler and making sure Dale doesn't vanish into the night.
Yes, we'll all just go to sleep now.
Bill, get his pants and shoes.
Okey doke.
Of course, Bobby doesn't get the memo and gets, well, a little inspired.
Wematanye, Wematanye, Wematanye.
Bobby, cripes, put that thing down.
At first I was going to say that this is a weird place for Bobby to go, but rewatching the episode, it's pretty clear that Bobby is getting shamed and manipulated into believing everything Hank says throughout the trip. Joseph even tries to point out how this whole thing is just an excuse for their dads to play pranks on them, which is 100% true. So Bobby is really just embracing everything Hank's been pretending to care about, totally rejecting the notion that all of this might be a prank. I have to admit, as interesting as things have been up until this point, the third act does sort of lose me. I think they could have done a better job of making the ranger guy feel more like an intimidating authority figure rather than leaning into him being sort of this big, dumb idiot. But seeing Dale try to ditch the guys and having to be restrained is still pretty funny.
I was in the order myself. The straight arrow hasn't changed a bit since I was a boy.
There's also this cut scene that didn't get into the final airing of the episode, where the hippies see Hank trying to bury the crane and charge him like a horde of zombies, which is just delightfully absurd. And all of this builds to a final moment between Hank and Bobby, where Hank reveals that everything from the start was BS, and it was supposed to make the kids rally against their dads the same way Hank and his friends did against their fathers. And here's where Bobby actually breaks my heart a little bit, because when he hears that all of this was just an attempt to pit the boys against the adults, Bobby says, "I don't want to be against you, you're my dad, we're supposed to be on the same team." And there is just something so raw about that, just something that you would so hear from a kid that's been genuinely hurt. And I love that moment, but in the end, it turns out that the whooping crane was alive the whole time. The whole time. The whooping crane was alive the whole time. The crane itself was alive the entire time. The whole time. Even after spending a whole night in the cooler and being manhandled like a pulled pork sandwich, the crane just gets up and flies away. Or did it? Was Bobby actually a spiritual leader? Does Wematanye really exist? And did John Redcorn actually go and watch over Dale's wife while he was away? The answers to these questions will be revealed right now. No. Definitely not, and yes, her spirit bag was indeed breathed into. So what's there to say about the old snipe hunt episode? Well, it certainly feels like something of a dated experience, or at least one that's highly specific to a very sort of, tiny group of people that went through this sort of experience. I mean, I went on a few Boy Scout camping trips myself back in the day, and had a bunch of weird and perplexing moments too, but never anything quite like this. That was more about crafts and hiking and campfire stories, and less about murdering endangered species. But to each their own. I think the strength of this episode comes from just how different the guy's view of the trip is from Bobby's, and getting to see each new trial does keep things fresh. It just sort of loses gas in the final stretch, and I'm so taken aback by the deus ex machina of the crane being alive the entire time. The entire time! That sort of thing, just gets in the way of the super, interesting emotional connection formed between Hank and Bobby, and whatever, I guess the crane was alive the entire time. Thankfully, it does sow the seeds of Peggy's secret shame, and even ends the episode with this funny little exchange.
I bought a microwave.
Boy, I tell you what, this family goes through microwaves quicker than most people go through shoes.
Yeah.
But that's really all I have to say about it. It's fine, it's got some decent jokes, but its emotional core leaves something to be desired. The pranks are good, the pranks are alright, but everything else is just sort of okay. In any case, there's no time to shake our fists at that stupid crane, which was alive the entire time. We've got to move on to the next episode, which explores the wonderful world of golf, guitars, and gratuitous scenes of pouring beer.
Ma'am, you're gonna want to angle that glass.
You're blowing it. You're gonna get nothing but foam.
Yep.
So until then, this episode has indeed been reviewed to death. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
What's that flapping sound?
Taste the wind one last time, bird spirit.
Bobby!